There are things about my relationship that the world never knew, not because they were hidden deliberately, not because I was ashamed of them or afraid of what people would think, but because some things are so deeply personal, so quietly sacred, that putting them into words and handing them to the world feels like an act of betrayal against the very moments you are trying to describe. I have stayed silent about most of this for a very long time, longer than people realize. And the silence was never about protecting an image or managing a narrative. It was about protecting something real, something that belonged entirely to the two of us and to no one else. But today I am going to speak, not everything. Some things will always remain mine, but enough. Enough for the truth to finally exist somewhere outside of my own memory. My name is Prince Hamdan, and what you are about to hear is the story of my relationship, the real one, the one that never made it into any headline or any version of events that the world constructed without my voice. The first thing the world got wrong was the beginning. Everyone has an idea about how a relationship like mine starts. They imagine formality, protocol, two people brought together by circumstance or family or the mechanics of a life lived inside structure. And while I understand why people assume that, it was not how it happened. The beginning was nothing like what anyone would expect. It was ordinary in the most extraordinary way. There was no grand setting, no arranged moment designed to feel significant. There was just a person and a conversation, and something in that conversation that felt so unexpectedly honest that I found myself paying attention in a way I had not paid attention to something in a very long time. She said something that caught me completely off guard. Not because it was provocative or dramatic, but because it was true in a way that most people are too careful to be around me. People around me tend to be careful. She was not. And that lack of carefulness was the most refreshing thing I had encountered in years. What the world also never knew was how much she challenged me, not in a combative way, not in the way of someone trying to prove a point or assert themselves against the weight of who I am publicly, but in the quiet, persistent way of someone who genuinely believed I was capable of more than I was currently giving. She would listen to me speak about something and then ask a question that reframed the entire thing in a way I had not considered. She would sit with an idea I presented and turn it around in her hands until she found the angle I had missed, and she did all of this without ever making me feel diminished, without ever making it feel like correction. It felt like collaboration, like two minds that worked differently and were better together because of that difference. I had never had that before, not in the way she gave it to me, and I did not fully appreciate how rare it was until I no longer had access to it. She also never treated my poetry the way most people treat it. Most people receive my poetry as an extension of the public version of me, as something produced by Prince Hamdan for the world to admire or analyze or quote, but she received it as communication, direct and personal communication from one person to another. She would read something I wrote and respond not with admiration but with understanding. Sometimes she would say something back that showed me she had found a meaning inside the words that I had not even consciously put there, as though she could hear things in my writing that I was saying without realizing I was saying them. That kind of being known, it is not something you can manufacture or find easily. It either exists between two people or it does not. Between us, it existed completely, and I was careless with it in ways I would spend a long time making peace with. The untold part of our story is not the dramatic moments. The world has already built enough drama around us without my contribution. The untold part is the quiet, the private texture of what we actually were together when no one was watching, and nothing was required of either of us. There were conversations that lasted well past any reasonable hour because neither of us wanted to be the one to end them. There were silences that felt more connected than most conversations I've had with other people. There were small moments of genuine laughter that had nothing to do with anything significant. Just two people finding the same things funny and being surprised by it every time. Those moments are the ones that do not survive in any public record. They exist only in memory now, mine and perhaps hers. And they are the truest record of what we were. It was something she told me early on that I dismissed at the time, but I've thought about constantly since. She said that she was not afraid of my world. She was afraid of disappearing inside it. She did not say it dramatically or as a warning. She said it almost casually, in the middle of another conversation, like it was simply an honest observation she was sharing without particular urgency. And I heard it. I registered it. I even responded to it in what felt like a thoughtful way in that moment. But I did not truly understand what she was telling me. I understood the words. I did not understand the depth of what she was describing. The fear of disappearing inside someone else's world is not a small fear. It is the fear of losing yourself, of having your own identity slowly absorbed by the demands and the visibility and the sheer scale of someone else's existence. And that is exactly what kept happening to her, no matter how hard I tried to prevent it. My world is loud, and she was someone who needed space to be heard. I also never told anyone what those early days of distance actually felt like from my side. When she first began to pull back, I did not immediately understand it as pulling back. I understood it as processing. She was someone who went inward when things were difficult, who needed time and space to work through things internally before she could bring them outward into conversation. So when the distance started, I gave her room. I told myself I was being respectful of how she worked, that I was giving her what she needed. But I was also, if I'm being completely honest, avoiding the discomfort of pushing into a conversation I was not sure I was ready to have. It was easier to give her space and call it consideration than to sit with the possibility that the space was actually growing into something I would not be able to cross later. By the time I realized the difference, it had already grown too wide. People never knew how many times I almost said exactly the right thing. How many times I sat across from her, or held a phone, or stood in a moment where everything that needed to be said was right there, fully formed inside me, ready to come out, and then something stopped it. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated than fear. A kind of inability to be fully vulnerable in a way that left nothing protected. I had spent my entire life being seen, and yet had never fully learned how to be seen in the way that actually matters. The way that requires you to remove every layer of composure and simply stand there as a person who needs something and is willing to say so directly. She needed me to do that, to come to her without the poetry and without the careful words, and just say plainly what I was feeling and what I was feeling and what I needed and what I was afraid of. And I almost did it so many times, I can count the moments. They are burned into me with a clarity that is almost cruel. What also went untold was how she loved, because the world has spent a lot of time talking about her leaving, about the end, about what broke and why, but very little has been said about how she loved when things were good, and she loved in a way that was so specific and so attentive that it almost felt like she had studied me before we even met. She knew what I needed before I said it. She knew when to push and when to pull back. She knew how to be present in the exact way that was most useful for whatever I was carrying that day. She matched her presence to whatever the moment required without ever being asked to. That kind of emotional intelligence is not something you find often, and I benefited from it constantly without ever adequately reflecting it back to her. I received her love fluently. I gave mine haltingly, and that imbalance accumulated over time into something neither of us could ignore. The relationship also carried a weight that came entirely from outside us, from the visibility, from the opinions, from the people who felt entitled to have thoughts about something they had no real access to. She was not built for public observation of her private life. She had a strong sense of what belonged to her and what belonged to the world, and the line between those two things was something she guarded carefully. But that line kept getting crossed, not always dramatically, sometimes in small ways that most people would not even notice. But she noticed. Every time, and every crossing left a small mark, and small marks accumulate the same way that small silences do, into something that eventually becomes impossible to overlook. There is one moment I have never spoken about, a moment that I think about more than any other when I am being honest with myself about where things truly began to turn. We were together and everything on the surface felt fine, normal, warm even. And then she looked at me in a way that was different from any way she had looked at me before. Not with anger, not with sadness, with something quieter and more unsettling than either. She looked at me with the eyes of someone who was starting to accept something, who was in the early stages of making peace with a reality she had been hoping would change. I saw it. I recognized it immediately as something significant, and I chose in that moment to address something completely different instead. To keep the surface fine and normal and warm because disturbing it felt like more than I could manage right then. That choice. That single moment of choosing comfortable surface over difficult truth. That was the moment I have returned to more than any other, because I believe now that it was the moment where things could have gone differently if I had just been willing to sit in the discomfort of honesty. The untold story of my relationship is not a story of villains or victims. It is not a story of love lost because it was never real. It is a story of two people who were genuinely right for each other in many of the ways that matter most and still could not make it work because the conditions around them and the patterns within them kept getting in the way. It is a story about how even real love requires more than feeling. It requires skill, the skill of communication, the skill of vulnerability, the skill of choosing someone in the moments when choosing them is inconvenient or frightening or requires you to put down something else you have been holding too tightly. Love without those skills is like trying to build something beautiful with no knowledge of how to use the tools in your hands. You can see exactly what you want to create. You just keep failing to build in a way that holds. I am Prince Hamdan, and the untold story of my relationship is simply the story of what it actually was, not the version built from outside observation, not the drama that other people constructed from pieces they were never meant to have. Just two people, a real connection, a series of moments that mattered, and an ending that did not have to happen but did because neither of us knew how to stop it in time. That is the truth I have been carrying. And now at least some of it exists somewhere other than inside me.